Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on what's new in permissions for Business Central 2022 Wave 1. My name is Stig Kildendal, and I'm a software engineer at the App Foundation team.
My name is Agnieszka Potulska-Tylenda, and I'm a software engineer in Server Runtime team. During the session, Damien Girard, senior software developer from Server Runtime team, will join us from a remote Microsoft office. Let's get started.
We'll start with a super short introduction to permissions. Then we'll go over our new feature, Configurable Permission Set Assignment. We'll then introduce two powerful new platform capabilities, Inherent Permissions and Isolated Events. After that, we'll go over the new login permission sets that we're introducing with this release of Business Central. And last but not least, we'll present composite permission sets, which is an exciting new way to structure your system's security. And at the end, we'll wrap it up. But before we dive into what's new in permissions for Business Central, let's briefly sum up what permissions are. You can really think of permissions as a layered system. At the very bottom, we have the license, which describes what a customer or partner can do. It's mostly used on-prem and is not really in the scope for this session. So let's move on to entitlements. Entitlements is a list describing which objects a user is entitled to use. It's kind of the new license for the cloud. Then we have permission sets. Permission set describes a group of permissions, and you cannot edit permission sets provided by Microsoft or extensions. We also have user groups here. User groups are simply a list of permission sets. So a user group can be assigned any number of permission sets, and a single user can have 0 or more permission sets and 0 or more user groups. At the very top, we have permissions, which is the actual permissions given for an object. But permissions is really just one layer. We're just illustrating it like this to respect the grouping mechanisms. So if you want to be able to execute a given object, you need access through all three layers. And that was all we have time for today for explaining the basics. Now let's get into what's new. So what are we looking to achieve? Well, first of all, we want to simplify permission sets. We want to move away from these huge permission sets, which are hard to manage, and make it easier to determine which user should get what permission sets. We also want to create understandable building blocks. So we want to raise the level of abstraction and talk about permission sets rather than individual permissions. We also want to remove the maintenance burden. So we want to reduce the friction that comes with each update of Business Central and the friction that comes with addition of new users. Lastly, we want to improve the stability of our critical code paths. So we want to ensure our product stability, even if changes to permissions needs to be done, no app should break the entire service. And with that, let's jump into our first new feature, Configurable Permission Set Assignment. But in order to understand this improvement, let's first take a look at what used to happen when a new user logs into Business Central for the very first time. Let's take the delegated admin as an example. The very first time the delegated admin logs into Business Central, the user will be assigned the super permission set or very similar capable permissions. This was hard-coded in the system, so it wasn't something you could configure, it was just based on the user's plan. Now, the system administrator wasn't too happy about this and was in a hurry to fix these permissions, reduce them to the proper level, and restore peace and order. Now, we know this isn't ideal, and that's why we are happy to announce that with the new version of Business Central, this is getting improved. So let's jump straight into the demo of configurable assignment of permission sets. All right, so I'm here in Business Central, and I'm going to go to the users page. And as we see, there's just one user, the admin user, that we're currently logged in as. We have the permission sets here. All right, now let's change the default permissions assigned. We do this on the new license configuration page. On this page, you see, first of all, a notification that we are currently using implicit company permissions, which is not recommended. You also see out here that none of the permissions are customized. We see the different plans, for example, the delegated admin agent. We also see the D365 Business Central, as well as the Business Central for IWEs, which we are going to use for this one. We see that permissions are not customized, and we see here that they will be assigned the business premium for the first company that they sign into. And this is the default behavior today. Whatever company you sign into first, you'll get some permissions. And these permissions are hard-coded in the system. So let's try this out. Let's go first to the users page. You see here there's only one user, the current admin user. Now let's sign in as a new user who has the Business Central for Information Workers license assigned. So we'll log in as Jane here in the demo environment. And now the user will be just-in-time created. When the user is just-in-time created, the default user groups and permission sets will be assigned. And we go back to our admin user and we refresh the users list. And now we can see that Jane was assigned the D365 Business Premium for Kronos, because Kronos happened to be the first company that she logged into. But now we can actually change this behavior. So we can go to the license configuration page again, and then we can configure our license. We'll edit it, and then we'll customize the permissions. We see this notifications that this only affects newly created users assigned this license, and the existing users won't be affected. Okay, that's great. Now let's delete these defaults and assign our own. So we don't want to give D365 Business Premium, which contains a lot of permissions. Instead, let's assign a smaller user group, such as the team member. And now, something new, you actually specify the company for which these user groups should be assigned. So we'll specify Kronos. And this is a very different behavior from what it used to be, where it's just the first company you sign into. Now you can actually specify the company. So again, we'll go to a new tab and we'll sign in as another user with the same license. And now this user is going to be just-in-time created and assign our new custom permission set and user groups. And we go back to our admin tab, we refresh the page, and we see that Jack has been created. And Jack was assigned a D365 team member user group for Kronos. And this really removes the burden of having to configure each user's permissions individually after they have been created. Instead, the system administrator just goes in once and defines what user groups and permission sets should be assigned for each license. And then each user will be assigned exactly the permission sets that you want them to have. But there's also some great new platform capabilities for permissions that Agnieszka will tell you about now.
Thank you, Stig. Now, let's move on to another brand new feature released with Business Central Wave 1 2022 called Inherent Permissions. This feature will help to simplify the existing permission sets, lower their maintenance cost, and also make sure to improve the product stability by ensuring that the required permissions are properly set up for critical code paths. Inherent permissions allow to elevate user permissions in a given code context. These permissions are granted only for the duration of the specific method execution. As soon as the AL session exits the method scope, these permissions are revoked and are no longer present in the system. This gives more power to the developer, who can now fine-tune the permissions to be granted to a very specific scope, limited to a method where the executing code needs to have these permissions present. If the scope is very narrow, the developer can decide to exclude that specific permission from permission management. As a result, the existing permission sets can become less complex and easier to understand and maintain. Inherent permissions can help to ensure product stability. With this feature, the developers can elevate specific permissions locally in a critical code paths, like company initialization or login process, and make sure that this path won't fail due to missing permission error. Now, how all of that can be achieved? So, the new method attribute called inherent permissions has been implemented. It has the following syntax. First argument is permission object type, which is a new AL enum which contains members of object types that can have permissions assigned to. Second argument is object ID, followed by actual permissions. And these permissions have to be declared in the same convention as currently permissions are defined in the permission sets. So read, insert, modify, and execute. Decorating the procedure with this attribute will mean that within that specific method scope, these permissions are inherently present. Now that we know the syntax, let's move on to the actual code sample. This is an example which is a great illustration of how inherent permissions are useful for increasing the stability of the critical code paths and limiting the scope of the granted permission. The implementation comes from Logging Management Code Unit. As you can see previously, all the users of the system would have to have indirect read permission to GL entry assigned only to be able to get the default work date during the login process. Now with inherent permissions, this permission was removed from the login permission set, and users are granted this indirect permission only for the duration of that specific method. So how does this internally work? How is it implemented in the platform? In this diagram, we can see a call stack of a procedure A that invokes a procedure from code unit A that invokes a procedure from another code unit B. Since the method A has inherent permissions attribute declared on top of it, all the methods that are invoked within that method will get the additional permissions assigned. It is worth mentioning at this point that the objects that the inherent permissions are given to need to be declared in the same extension, in the same application as the declaring method. There is a slight difference with event subscribers. By default, the inherent permissions are not being pushed down the call stack for the event subscriber method execution. This behavior can be modified by explicitly adding the inherent permission attribute on top of the event subscriber method. So in this case, in the diagram, the additional permission is going to be granted to the event subscriber method scope as well. As we've seen in these diagrams, the best usage pattern for inherent permissions is to use them in the isolated methods that don't contain a lot of complex logic and have a single responsibility. If the developers start incorporating this principle, as a result, the AL code will be much simpler and cleaner, and also the permission sets are going to be simplified. So what are the current limitations of inherent permissions? So for now, for release 20.0, it is enabled only for the scope on-prem, which means that first-party Microsoft AL code can use inherent permissions. But we plan to open that up for cloud scope as well in the minor release. And it's also worth to reiterating at this point that the scope for the inherent permissions is limited to the objects declared in the same extension. Moving on to another feature from this release called isolated events. This feature will greatly improve the product stability by improving the stability of the critical code paths. So what is an isolated event? An isolated event is a new type of event that, when it is raised, it guarantees that all the event subscribers are going to be executed, even if some of them fail. So the execution chain for the event subscribers is not going to be interrupted on error. This comes with the same advantages and also disadvantages as codeunit.run. So each subscriber is executed in its own transaction. Failures cause the transaction to be rolled back, and errors are trapped when the execution continues. You need to also make sure that there are no write transactions open before you raise this event. So the new isolated events that were implemented in the application team are, for example, on company open completed. This event will defer errors until after the user has already logged in. When it comes to the syntax is very straightforward. Only the new Boolean flag isolated was added to existing event syntax. So in this example, in this slide, we can see that existing business event attribute just got another parameter added to it called isolated. This makes the feature relatively easy to uptake, as the event subscriber remains the same signature. You need to only add true to the event itself. Remember to revise the code that is calling this to make sure that there are no open-write transactions before the event is raised. So in order to make the login process more stable, a new isolated event has been implemented called onCompanyOpen completed. This is raised after completing onCompanyOpen method. This will make sure that opening company will no longer fail and the users are going to be able to log in even if any errors occur. There is also another event, so system app subscribes to onCompanyOpen completed and raises another isolated event called onAfterLogin. So all of that was implemented in order to harden, in this example, the login process. But there was also a lot of work with regards to login on the application side, and Stig will talk more about it now.
Yeah, thanks. On the application side, we use these features in order to improve the login process. And ultimately, with the use of these features, we were able to create a new login permission set. So today, D365 Basic is the current minimal permission set that you need to log into Business Central. It will give you access to most pages, as well as give you access to initialize a company in case you're logging into one that isn't initialized. However, it might contain too many permissions, or more than is what is necessary for all users. And that's why today we're introducing the login permission set. The login permission set provides a much smaller building block for you to use. The purpose of the login permission set is to give you access to Business Central and nothing more. By making sure that you assign the login permission set to each of your users in Business Central, you're making sure that they can always access Business Central. And in fact, it's already included in most of our permission sets, including D365 Basic. But this is just the first step. We also want to create a new permission set for Company Initialize, which we're going to release with the next major. Once we have these smaller building blocks that we can pick and choose from, then we can actually deprecate D365 Basic. And then you get much more flexibility in terms of what permissions you want to assign. So let's take a closer look at what's actually included in this permission set. On the left-hand side, you see the D365 Basic. And you see that it contains a lot of permissions. On the right-hand side is the login permission set. The login permission set contains indirect permissions to a few base application objects. It also includes System Application Basic. And then on top of that, it has no wildcard permissions, meaning that each code unit, table, etc. that is used in the login process will be defined in this login permission set. So by using the login permission set, you get more flexibility in terms of what permissions you want each user to have, while still making sure that they can always access Business Central. And now that we are talking about structuring your permission system as you want it to be, I'll hand it over to Damian, who will present a new tool to do exactly that.
Thank you, Stig and Agnieszka. Hi everyone, my name is Damian, and today I will talk about permission composition, new feature that we added in Business Central 2022 Wave 1. So, as a little reminder, a permission set basically contains permissions. You can define permissions inside the application or inside an AL object through the Visual Studio code editor. So, a permission set is a simple object that contains permissions. But now let's make interesting things with them. A composed permission set. So, a composed permission set is basically an assemblage of multiple permission sets all together. As you can see, the permission set that we had on the previous slide is here, and it contains permissions. There is also another permission set that contains other set of permissions. And if we put these together, well, this looks like a tree, then this tree then will result into a composed permission set that includes the permissions from a permission set and from another permission set. As you can see with the arrows, the permissions flows from one of these little boxes to the other one at the bottom. And the same with this one. So let's look at a concrete example. Inside the application today, we have Dynamics 365 Business Premium. Well, this permission set includes other permission sets, Dynamics 365 Business Full Access and Dynamics 365 Manufacturing Edit. What we would like to have is the resulting permissions of this permission set and this permission set. And we can see that this permission set, Dynamics 365 Business Full Access, includes other permission sets. And the whole idea is that all these permission sets all the permissions flows down from any leaf from the trees to the root. And meaning that Dynamics 365 Business Premiums includes the permissions of all the included permission sets. So, how to define a composed permission set? Last year, we introduced the ability to define the composed permission sets inside an extension. So, as you can see, in an AL object permission set, then you can define the included permission sets. For example, in this case, Company Edit, Dynamics 365 Basic, etc., etc. A permission set, as said earlier, includes as well permissions. But what is new in this new version of Business Central is that it is possible to define inside the application these relations between permission sets. So there is a new table named Tenant Permission Set Relations. And its job is to define the relations between two permission sets. So it's a simple table. You have from a permission set toward another permission set. And when you created a relation, then the platform uses this information to build the tree as shown a bit before. And then this tree ends up all composed together and you get a composed permission set. But I'm not asking you to go and insert directly the data into this table. In update 1, a user interface will be available for you and administrators to go and create this kind of relations directly inside the client. So how to see the results of a permission composition? Well, there is a new system table named Expanded Permissions. And this table is actually a very important one because it's the source of truth. When you have this complex composition tree and you want to see what actually is the result of the composition that the platform did from all these different nodes all together, then this table shows you the result. As shown in this screenshot at the bottom, the whole Dynamics 365 Business Premium has these permissions being defined. What are the benefits of all these new features? Well, for a partner, you can really create a fine-grained hierarchies that make sense for your application, for you as a developer. And now we added the abilities for administrators to do exactly the same. They can create hierarchies that make sense for their organization. Because an administrator doesn't necessarily have the same structure as a partner while they are doing the development. So now you can really compose these permission sets all together to something that really makes sense for you. You decide how to structure your system security. I'll be back in a bit for more exciting features. Meanwhile, back to the studio.
Thanks, Damian. Now let's go over some best practices of how to structure your permission sets with composability and all of these new tools in mind. Now we do know that our permission sets are not split in these perfect small componentized sets that you can easily pick from. But if we were to rebuild our existing permission sets today, how would we go about it? Well, first of all, we would make small isolated permission sets. And each of these permission sets would be related to a feature. So today, D365 Business Full Access contains a lot of different permissions. But we can see customer edit as one scenario. Editing a customer is one single scenario. So let's just look at that for now. Now we could even split customer edit into multiple scenarios. Editing certain parts of a customer is one scenario. Editing other parts is another scenario. But let's just look at editing a customer as one single scenario. Well, then from there, we would create understandable building blocks. So we would create a customer read and a customer edit permission set. Now these are the assignable permission sets. On the bottom, you see the unassignable permission sets. The unassignable permission sets is where we would define our permissions. And you also see that we define the customer objects, which means that we wouldn't define wildcard permissions. Instead, we would define all the permissions that are needed for this scenario. Then from there on, we build these building blocks. Now we can use the assignable permission sets to pick and choose which functionalities we want our sets to include. So you see customer reads include the unassignable customer read as well as customer objects. And then you see that the customer edit includes the customer read as well as some permissions to edit. And that's pretty much how we would go about it in order to build these building blocks. But what if further permissions were required? So to edit a customer, you would also need to be able to edit the customer's bank account. You would also need access to the GL entry to perform some action on the customer. Well, then it depends on the scenario, right? For some scenarios, we could split the permission set further. We might create a permission set for editing a customer's bank account. And in order to do that operation, you need that permission set as well. We could also use indirect permissions, which you've seen that we've done for GL entry. But what if I didn't want the GL entry there at all? Well, then we also now have the option to use inherent permissions. And this is sort of the end goal, right? That we have a lot of pieces, a lot of different building blocks that you can use and you can pick from. And that would make composing permission sets a whole lot simpler. But we are not quite there yet. But we do have another tool for you in case you don't find our existing permission sets fit your system security. And I'll let Damian introduce you to that now.
Thanks. Now I will talk about another very exciting feature we added in this new version of Business Central, named exclusion. Let's get started. So imagine, what if Microsoft, our partner, designed a hierarchy that is not good for you. It's not fine-grained enough. And let's say that it includes too many permissions. For example, in these three that we showed before, let's say we are not interested in HR functionalities from our employees, but I want all the other features, but I don't want this specific set of features. Until now, you would use the feature named copy permission set. But this had the little issue that then you need to synchronize for quite a while yourself all the copied permissions. It's a hassle and it's a lot of work for not a lot of gain benefit. So this new feature that we added is named exclude a permission set. So in this table that I showed previously, there is a new field named type. And this type can be include or exclude. What does this translate to? For example, let's look on the right to this tree. On the employee permission set that I created as an administrator, I decided I would like to have the Dynamics 365 Business Full Access permission set, but I do not want to have the Dynamics 365 HR Edit. So a relation set is being created between employee to Dynamics 365 HR Edit, and we marked it as exclude. This means that every time the algorithm will walk through the tree and find all the permission sets, every occurrence of Dynamics 365 HR Edit will be excluded. And if this node is being excluded, then of course all the included node that it includes are excluded as well. The whole branch of the tree is being removed. So excluding a permission set is one thing. but we also allows you to exclude a single or more specific permissions on a given object. So in a similar fashion as the other tables, we added a new type field to the tenant permission table. And this type field means that you can include or exclude, which is an interesting one, specific permissions from a given object. So let's see an example on the right. Let's say we have all the permissions coming from Dynamics 365 Business Full Access. So on the employee, let's say I do not wish to have a modify and delete permission for this table named HR confidential command line, because this is a requirement that my manager asked for me to implement. Well, now I can create a new permission of type exclude, and for that specific table, I'm excluding the modify and delete permission. So the resulting permission is that all the permissions coming from this node, D365 Basic, D365 Shared, they flow down the tree, D365 Business Full Access, and they flow to employee. And then we have this HR confidential command line with all the permissions. We do not want modify and delete, so we exclude them. So once all the permission has been included all together, then we exclude these permissions. So what does this mean? Excluding a permissions and permission sets is the ultimate administrator power tool to fine-tune permissions. Because at any level of the permission tree, then you can decide to exclude a permission set or a set of permissions. In the end, this really allows you to have a fine-grained permissions system for your organization that doesn't include too many rights. For example, on this example, I put that employees must not have access to HR data. So we use our little scalpel and go on each of the permission sets, and then we just remove the different permissions that are not needed for our requirement. And now back to the studio, where Stig will demo this new client feature showing how to do that.
Thanks, Damian. So again, this is a preview that we will release in an upcoming minor. But let's jump into the product. So you see here that I'm on the permission sets page. And now I'll go on and I'll create a new permission set. So everything looks as it used to. I'll call it employee and I'll name it employee access. This is my basic employee permission set. I'll open it up. And again, everything looks pretty much as we're used to. There's no permissions defined, but now we can also compose a permission set. We get this new tab with permission sets, and from here on, we can include a new permission set. So I'll include something here, and now I need to base it on something. So I'll base it on business full access. And by including this permission set, all of the permissions in this is now included in this permission set. So this permission set contains this one. And we can also see what's inside D365 Business Full Access. We can see that the login permission set is there. We can expand that further and look at what permission sets are there. But what if I want to remove some permission? I don't want my employees to be able to edit companies. Well, I can simply click this button, and now it's been excluded from this entire permission set. So you see it marked here in red. Let's exclude something else. For example, HR capabilities. So we'll exclude this, and we'll exclude this setup as well. But how do I actually see the result of this entire composition? Well, you see it in the expanded permissions. So by opening up this page, you get computed what are the actual permissions for this permission set. And we can also filter on this. So let's look at some company tables. And we see here that the company table, we still do have read, which is nice, we want that. Let's look at some HR objects. Okay, we do have the AR confidential command line, but luckily we can actually remove that permission. So let's go here and edit it, and let's choose the type exclude. and we'll select the object that we want to remove. And then we'll exclude the read and insert and modify and delete permission. And what that should do is remove the permissions entirely from this permission set. And to verify that, we of course just make sure that it's saved. And then we can go back to the expanded permissions in order to verify that this permission is not part of the set. So we'll filter again on the object name, HR. And it's not there. Perfect. So that's one way that you can structure your permission sets. We can build these permission sets from the top up, from a big permission set, but there's also another way we could go about it. So let's try that out. So I'm here on the same page again. I'll create a new permission set, my basic. I'll call it basic access. And I'll go into that permission set. So instead of using a big permission set now, what I'll do is I'll include a minimal permission set. And from there on, I can add my own permissions. So a good one to include would be the new login permission set, which is a pretty minimal permission set. So I'll include that. And now I also want to give some permissions to the objects in the product. So I'll maybe include some permission set that my partner provided me with. I'll include that as well. And at this point, we now have 2 permission sets included, and we're pretty happy with this basic permission set. So this is another way to do it. So which one should you use? Should you use the top-down or the bottom-up approach? Well, it really depends on how your permission sets are structured. If you have a lot, so let's say you have a very customized solution with a lot of different permission sets that you build yourself, then maybe the bottom-up approach is the best. If you're pretty happy with the permission sets that Microsoft provide, then you can build on top of the permission sets we have and exclude the few permissions you don't want to. All right, so in conclusion, 2022 Wave 1 offers new powerful tools to define permission sets. Today we demonstrated some simple examples, but it can very easily get a lot more complicated. So it's up to you, developers and administrators, to use them to offer secure and manageable systems.
Thank you, Stig. Now is a perfect time to wrap up our session. Today we talked about how, with the latest release of Business Central Wave 1 2022, users will be able to simplify permission sets and management with inherent permissions, create understandable building blocks with composite permissions, remove maintenance burden with the new logging permission set, and finally improve stability of critical code paths with the use of isolated events. Now, this concludes our session. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.